Hi, I'm Rebecca Armendariz, business rep with SEMA OE3.
Hi, this is Adam Cole, business rep with CEMA OE3.
Zeb Feldman, unsurprisingly also a business rep with SEMA OE3. And we're here today to talk to you primarily about layoffs and the order of layoffs, so that many questions that have been coming in over the last couple of months hopefully can be partially addressed here. And I'm sure it will generate some more questions and discussion, but at least you'll have the facts with you so you have a better handle on how layoffs are negotiated. I know people hear the term layoffs and immediately hairs on the back of your neck stick up. We are not contemplating layoffs right now in the county. However, as many of you know, there's an ongoing economic crisis as a result of COVID, as well as other factors that are leading us towards budgetary shortfalls. You know, already many departments are contracting. The state of the county budget is negative, one of contraction. Folks are shedding vacant funded positions, contractors, unfunded positions left and right. And in this budget cycle, we're seeing a lot of reductions in Object 1 and Object 2 funding. As a reminder, I know many SEMA members are very familiar with the budget, some are not. Object 1 is primarily people. Object 2 is primarily stuff, right? Ordering furniture, paying rent, things of that nature. So we're looking at contractions in both of those areas. However, right now, nobody's being laid off. Kind of the scope that we can see into the future is there will likely not be the elimination of occupied funded positions for the foreseeable future, but we do know more cuts are coming in August. Those targets have already been given out. And we also know that many things like reimbursement from the CARES Act, from the HEROES Act, ERAF funding, all of those are going to play into how much money the county captures as a result of our activity and treatment and emergency disaster service work related to COVID. If that turns out to be extremely generous, which we're not planning for, then we'll have a far lesser impact on the county budget. If it is more middle of the road, which is kind of what we're anticipating, there will be a significant impact to the county budget. And that means that some positions will be eliminated, whether or not that's vacant funded positions or whether or not it's funded occupied positions. Think someone's in that. We can't predict right now, but at least for the foreseeable future, that's not happening. And also for the foreseeable future, we are not foreseeable. In the current state of affairs, we are not in negotiations with the county as we were in the court to discuss specific reductions. For example, furloughs, incentives to leave, voluntary reduced work hours, all the things that we're going to be talking about later on in this discussion, as well as the mechanical impacts of the layoff itself. Also, for those of you keeping score at home, we're referring to the layoff procedures. It's Article 15 in your contract. So that's really what the meat and potatoes of this discussion is going to be about. I think Rebecca is going to kick us off here about what we're planning to cover specifically in today's presentation.
Thank you, Zeb. So today we'll be covering the definitions that you could of the vocabulary and the terminology used in Article 15 of the contract, layoff procedures, steps and bargaining prior to layoffs, layoff notice and the order of layoffs, the impacts of layoffs, and what you can expect and what you can do to prepare, in addition to the questions that any of you submitted that aren't covered under these subjects.
Okay. Thanks, Rebecca. So kicking off there, we want to get folks comfortable with some of the terminology and vocabulary that we're going to be talking about today. And along with this, we'll touch on a little bit more explanation on each point, but we'll cover that in more detail as it comes up in referring to the specific sections that we're going to be going through. So kicking off with definitions, we want to do a quick review on seniority and how it functions in the SEMA contract. So unlike some other union contracts that folks may be familiar with, seniority in SEMA is time with the county, not just time in a SEMA position. So that means that if you were initially hired into a GAA position or an IFPTE or SCIU or RNPA position 10 years ago, and then 5 years ago you transferred or promoted into a SEMA position, your seniority counts for that whole 10-year period when you were first hired into a coded position with the county. So there's Some benefits to that, of course, for folks that joined the county in a lower position and promoted up. It's a common feature you'll see in a lot of management level contracts where those exist. And the general reason for that is you don't want to create disincentives for people to promote, especially as you're looking at possibly economic dangerous times up ahead. If your seniority was going to reset, it would put your job first on the chopping block, and it would be a strong disincentive for folks to promote. That's the function of how seniority works. You get seniority for the entire period that you've been employed with the county, whether or not you've been within SEMA that entire time. Secondarily, we want to talk a little bit about probationary periods and underlying status, what those things mean. As we're going to see when we're talking about order of layoff and the rights that you have during the layoff process, it's essential to identify in what positions you have underlying status and how that relates to a probationary period. So achieving underlying status in a position, you can do that one of two ways for a position. The first one is that when you're initially hired into a county position, you will serve a 9-month probationary period. You need to pass that period to achieve your original underlying status with the county. Once you've passed that 9-month probationary period, you've achieved underlying status. Of course, if someone transferred during that first 9-month probationary period, that will cause a reset. So it means 9 months in the same position without transferring. Once you've passed that period, you've achieved underlying status. Subsequently, over the course of your career at the county, you may take a promotion, you may transfer, et cetera. As folks will be familiar, you will serve what's considered to be a subsequent probationary period. Functions a little bit differently from the original probationary period because you've already achieved underlying status in a position. What that means, of course, is if someone was to be released from a subsequent probationary period, they'll have a right to return to a former position. It's not a severance of your employment with the county, just with that position you had transferred or promoted into. However, for folks who pass that subsequent probationary period, you then achieve underlying status in that position as well. And these things are important because when we go ahead and we're looking at what positions you have a right to, you have different rights in order to positions based on the positions in which you've achieved underlying status. And we'll look at that in order of layoff and the positions in which you have a right to either in place or displace from. The last definition I want to hit real quick are those two definitions, in placement and displacement. They're referred to in that section 15 that we'll go through in a little more detail later on. But to get folks comfortable with what these terms mean, displacement is what folks will colloquially refer to as bumping. And what that means is that if I was to receive a layoff notice in my position, say I'm a management analyst, I receive a layoff notice, I was the least senior person in my department and the department has to cut a management analyst. If we went through the steps prior to getting to this and you get to displacement, when you exercise your right to displacement, you identify a position in your department or agency that someone occupies who has less seniority than you, and then you bump that person out of their position. You have a right to that position, and then that person that you displaced kind of goes back to the beginning of this process, and they are then impacted by the layoff, jockeying for positions. Prior to that, you have in placement in a position. What in placement will mean is occupying a vacant funded position. And that could be anywhere in the county, not necessarily in your department or agency. So if you were impacted by a layoff notice, again, say you're a management analyst working in SSA, you receive a layoff notice, there's no vacancies in SSA, but over at probation, there's a vacant management analyst position. You'd be able to occupy that position by in placing in that position. And that means you occupy that position, nobody was in it previously, so you didn't have to bump anybody out, and now you've captured that position. So those are the two terms that are referred to variously in that section without a clear definition, in placement and then displacement. Those are the basic definitions we're going to be working with today. The second thing, or the next thing we're going to hit, is talk a little bit about what is SEMA doing right now as we're anticipating additional budget cuts, and then what will this process look like as it becomes more formal? What are kind of the pre-layoff bargaining steps? What does SEMA advocate for? What rights do we have in this process as the budget's being going through.
Thank you, Adam. And two other definitions that just leapt to mind was golden handshake, because there's been not a confusion, but it refers to multiple things. And then also layoff from the context of, I think the word colloquial is excellent that Adam used earlier. When people hear the word layoff, perhaps in the private sector, you think you're losing your job. And in our contract, the term layoff refers to that you've been notified that your current position is being eliminated. It doesn't necessarily mean that you go out the door. So there's that distinction, right? You can get a notice of layoff if you do, and months from now, if we even come to that, that doesn't mean that you are losing your job. It means that you start that shuffle process that Adam just talked about. So that's a very significant difference, where you can get a notice of layoff and you could still end up working for the county for another 20 years, right? So we just want to make sure that there's not that confusion. With regards to golden handshake, all that means, again, it's another colloquial term. It refers to an incentive that the employer is putting on the table to get you to leave, right? Primarily it comes in two forms, which we'll talk about in a minute with what we're doing for bargaining, which is it could be some kind of a cash payment or offer, like, look, we're putting this amount of money on the table, take it and good luck, go in peace, right? Or alternatively, there's another option available to us as CalPERS participants, which is years of service. The county's limited. They can put 1 or 2 years of service on, which we'll talk about in pre-layoff bargaining in a moment. But those are the two definitions that I thought of. Are there any that we agreed what we were going to cover here? Are there any that leapt to mind, maybe that might be useful for people viewing that we haven't covered?
No, I think
Those two were helpful.
Okay.
Yeah. Bumping, golden handshakes.
Okay. All right. So the next item that we wanted to cover was pre-layoff bargaining. So what does that mean? Well, we've gotten a lot of questions from members who have seen what we bargained over at the court, and even saying, can I take that right now, right? If you're in the county, unfortunately, that's not available to you, fortunately or unfortunately. The reason that we were able to negotiate that at the court was, one, that SEMA took a leadership role in a coalition between SEIU, SEMA, and the court interpreters. Unfortunately, Skippy or SCPA did not participate. Why that's relevant is the court was in much worse budgetary shape than the county is. So they were very motivated to get people to leave so they could save money. They were very motivated to get people to take, actually I'll cover it in a second, the multiple things that we bargained over there to achieve cost savings. So pre-layoff bargaining, what is that and what does it mean? So first off, and Rebecca I think is going to talk about this at the end about what you can do next. But one thing that's out right now is a survey, right? So we're going to be taking our cues from you, the membership, as to what we prioritize and what we attempt to bargain. As always, it's a bargaining process. Just because everybody wants something doesn't mean we can automatically deliver it, right? But right now, we're sensing a lot of flexibility on the part of the employer. If there are cost savings to be had, the employer is very interested in it, right? That's preliminarily what we've heard from personalities on the board of supervisors, and also what we've heard from executive management. No formal offers or proposals have been made, but it's just what we've heard. So what does pre-layoff bargaining look like, and what am I referring to? Well, a good place to start is probably to look at the agreement that we hammered out with the court, right? Likely all of those options will be on the table. We'll be using survey results to determine what makes sense for this unit. What made sense for the court unit was a little bit from each of those menu options, right? So first off, they had a golden handshake. As we talked about, a golden handshake takes primarily two forms. One is a cash payment, and two is an extension of years of service. The county and any CalPERS participant, as a result of the PEPRA Reform Act, PEPRA, can only offer extension of years of service by 1 year or 2 years. That's it. They can't offer more than that. So that would mean, let's say you have 20 years in and they offer you a golden handshake and you accept it and you leave employment, you would get 1 or 2 years, depending on what we negotiated. So it would count as though you worked 22 years, as an example, for your pension formula. So hopefully folks understand that. something we're very aware of as business reps is that's great if someone is already vested in the pension plan. That's great if someone's near retirement. Gosh, does that stink if you're someone that's been working here for 4 years, maybe has a side business, wants to leave. That doesn't matter at all to you, right? It doesn't help you at all because you're not even vested in the plan. Cash options, cash payments. That's another option. What does that look like? Well, what we negotiated at the court was a fixed dollar amount, the court's case $15,000, plus $1,500 per year of service. Could look similar, could look very different on what happens at the county. There's a whole lot of other permutations. At the court, they said all takers are welcome. Anyone who wants to take this, we'll approve it with certain restrictions. We will approve it, but it was not offered to a limited population. We suspect, we don't know, but we suspect that here at the county, it will be different, that the county will narrowly look at departments or maybe even individual classifications and say, I'm making an offer that's been negotiated with SEMA to these classifications or people in these departments only. We suspect that it will not be a county-wide offer, an employer-wide offer, as it was at the court.
Yeah, and part of the way to think about that would be that it's not a cost-saving measure for the county. For example, if we have supervising probation counselors, for example, right? If the county doesn't have any need to have fewer supervising probation counselors, they're not going to be incentivized to convince 4 or 5 of those folks to retire if they're going to then immediately have to post those positions and fill 5 more.
That's right.
The county wouldn't recognize any benefit there. However, if we need to eliminate 2 positions as part of the budget cuts, then the county would be incentivized to say up to 2 people from this group of, say, supervising probation counselors can opt into a golden handshake. We're not going to incentivize 3 though, because we just need to post that 3rd vacancy immediately and fill it. So one helpful way to think about kind of this range of options that Zeb's talking about between furloughs, layoffs, incentivizing retirement is that some of these things result in temporary budget relief, which would be, for example, furloughs. That doesn't confer an ongoing cost savings to the county year after year, the way that a layoff or incentivizing someone to retire and then closing that vacant position provides long-term sustainability for the county's budget in a way that, for example, something like furloughs does not confer that benefit. So that's one of the reasons why retirement incentive, while it has some cost up front for the county, is particularly attractive because it provides that assurance of ongoing cost savings. Whereas if we agreed to furloughs for example, the end of the year from the county's perspective, in some sense, you'd either need to renew those furloughs or you're hoping that there's been some economic recovery over that time period. It doesn't provide that same level of assurance. Nonetheless, this kind of full smorgasbord of options that can definitely be on the table, as in the agreement at the court that we saw. There's some benefit to these whole range of options to be used in a comprehensive manner to try to really, what we're trying to do at the end of the day here is minimize the number of folks that would be in occupied positions that end up being cut. That's the goal. How many of these options can we pull from to reduce that number?
That's right. And so all of these options would be discussed in pre-layoff bargaining, primarily because we are very interested in averting layoffs, or at least that's our assumption. When we hear back from you, the members, we'll know exactly where you stand. And that leads right into the next point, which is layoffs is a legitimate response to budget cuts, right? If the survey, it's rare, but sometimes unions take that position. If the survey results come back and people say, I'm not interested in furloughs, I think we all know what furloughs are. I'm not interested in furloughs because that means that everybody has to take time off. It means that there's a negative impact onto my budget, everybody's individual budget, because they have to take furloughs with a loss of pay. And that just means that the work that isn't getting done gets piled on me while people are out. Obviously, we try to avoid that, but that's not always the case. You could reject that. You might say, sure, lay off some people. I don't want to lose my 3% raise that I have coming. I don't want to suffer furloughs. I don't want to divert money to voluntary separation, the golden handshake. That's a legitimate position. It's rare, I think, in this day and age that unions intentionally take that position, but it is a legitimate one. I'd be surprised if that won, but maybe it will. Maybe that's what people want. Other things that we will be talking about in pre-layoff bargaining is we'll be looking at the scope of the budgetary damage and what targets are. You might see language from us that tries to achieve layoff protection or reduces other impacts like furloughs or whatnot based on how much savings we achieve. All of that is bargainable. So it's going to be based on what us as your reps, our best ability to respond to your desires from the survey and also direction from your elected members on the executive board. So it's a process, but hopefully that menu of options is pretty clear as to what you can do. And let me just go through it once again. You've got golden handshakes of some variety. You've got VRWH, or voluntary reduced work hours, which is already a feature of the contract, but we can emphasize that. You could just say layoffs. I'm not willing to do anything, lay people off. You could forego pay raises is another thing that we've asked about. I think that will be unpopular, but again, who knows? Maybe people want to do that. And then of course there's I think I mentioned furloughs itself, and something that we haven't really discussed here, but I will throw out there as an idea, is a long-term leave. Something that can be very attractive to an employer. To Adam's point, it doesn't provide predictable ongoing savings. We use the term long-term, but usually that just means a fiscal year, right? So if somebody leaves for a fiscal year, maybe you have a side business, you're independently wealthy, your spouse has plenty of income rolling in, whatever, you're in good economic shape, and you can afford to step away from your job for a year for reasons, right? You want to go get that degree or whatever it is. That's also an option that a few people at the court found appealing. Maybe a few people here would. And it really provides a lot of savings to the employer, because let's say you cost the employer $150,000 a year with roll-up. They don't have to pay you your salary. They just continue to pay your medical benefits for that year. So, let's say it costs them $20,000, $30,000, something like that. They're saving $120,000. So pre-layoff bargaining, before anyone gets a layoff notice that we're talking about today and the mechanics that Adam's about to go into, before that happens to anybody, we're going to be having these discussions with the county. So I think I've covered that.
I think that the one other piece we want to hit. So those are kind of the things that we are mechanically able to bargain, but there are additional issues that SEMA can push politically. If, for example, we during this process want to identify other budgetary savings that the county is not appropriately evaluating. For example, if there's going to be an expansion of adult psych or something at the hospital that we think, look, this is a bad time when we're prioritizing expansion of facilities, acquisition of assets, whatever it may be, over people's jobs. This is inappropriate. That needs to be cut from the budget so that we can prioritize keeping folks. That's definitely advocacy that we're going to be doing. That's part of what SEMA's budget analysis is we're doing right now, trying to identify where those are. In addition, things like contracts. Thus far, I think we've seen that the county be fairly responsible with the contracts they're trimming back. But if we get to a point where we're looking at layoffs and there's still an inappropriate prioritization of maintaining contracts over SEMA staff, of course, that's something we'll be pushing back on. Those are all the kind of things that will come up prior to identifying, here's the final number that the county is looking to save. We want to get that number as low as possible by identifying other areas that that money can be saved, whether it was, leasing out county space we don't need anymore, any of those kind of options. That's kind of the additional advocacy that we can engage in there.
Absolutely.
Jumping forward though to kind of layoff order and notice. So if we go through all these steps, we bargain furloughs, golden handshakes, et cetera, whatever else there may be, or if it's the Wool membership that we just, say bring on the layoffs, that's a possibility as well. Though I think, like Zeb said, unlikely. But if we end up at a point where there's actual layoff notices going out, we want to talk a little bit about what that looks like. So contractually speaking, the county is obligated to give 30 days notice prior to layoffs. Practically speaking, there will be additional discussion beyond those 30 days. The county will approach us predictably some amount of time in advance of that so that we can have these discussions about pre-layoff bargaining, what other options are we going to put on the table prior to any actual notices going out. But if we get to that point where layoff notices go out, what will that look like? So the first thing we would say is that generally, and this is the way it worked during the last recession in 2008 when there was a contraction in the county, It also accords with my experience managing layoffs in the past. During an initial round of layoffs, you generally don't have anybody who's in, a permanent coded position end up having to actually go out the door. Through a combination of cutting any additional vacancies, provisional, probationary, and through a reshuffling of folks into positions that have been vacant and can be maintained or are newly made vacant by probationary releases, generally you don't end up seeing folks go out the door in that first round of layoffs. But of course, if cuts are deep or there's subsequent cuts, at a certain point you've cut fat away and you're getting into muscle there. So for that round of layoffs, what will that look like? So there's an order in layoffs in SEMA's contract that has 3 steps. The first step in that is that you're going to cut provisional positions. So these are provisional positions that are in SEMA codes. And now within each of these tiers, there's going to be an additional ordering by seniority. So within folks that are in provisional positions, you will go in inverse order of seniority. So what that means is if Zeb, Rebecca, and myself are all in provisional positions and we're all going to be cut. Unfortunately, Rebecca was the most recent one in, so she'd be the first one to receive a layoff notice. If we have to cut 2 people, I would be second. And then if you ended up cutting 3, then you get to Zeb. So that's inverse order of seniority, right? Once you've exhausted the provisional positions, then you would get onto probationary positions. Now, this can be both folks who are in their original probationary period and they have not yet achieved underlying status, but it could also be people that are just serving a subsequent probationary period. The impact on those 2 groups are going to, of course, be much different. But for this group, you again, in the second step of probationary, you again go in inverse order of seniority. So the least senior person will be the first person to be affected, second, third, and so on and so forth. For someone who hasn't yet achieved underlying status with the county, you'll have, and we'll get into this a little more as we look at impacts of what options do you have when you're affected by this. You'll have a different range of options compared to someone who has already achieved underlying status and was has a previous position to which they have a right to return. Part of the important thing to think about here is that if you're someone who happens to be in a subsequent probationary period when layoffs come out, what that means is that effectively you are more likely to be impacted by the layoff in a negative way, but you're not more likely to be out the door than you otherwise would have if you weren't in the subsequent probationary period position when layoffs came out. Because at the end of the day, you're going to be leaning on the totality of that seniority that you've accrued to either in place or displace into a position. But because you're in that subsequent probationary period, you come in this second round of people that could be eliminated, which means, you might end up in a position or a department that you didn't necessarily want to. So something to definitely keep in mind during this time period, if there's a position that you have an eye on that you want to transfer and promote into, something to keep in mind. It's likely not risking your employment with the county to take that position, but it is putting you in a group where you're more likely to be impacted in a negative way by a round of layoffs. Then the third order we have for layoff notice in order is going to be our regular folks in coded SEMA positions, and again, in inverse order of seniority. So for folks that are in SEMA codes, the least senior person would receive a layoff notice first, then second, then third, and then fourth. The last piece that we want to say on what this order looks like is, practically speaking, what does it look like when the county decides to cut positions from various areas? So cuts are generally going to be tied to a specific code in a specific department. So layoffs don't target individuals or people, they target positions within a department, and then you're going to start with that inverse seniority. So when you send out a layoff notice, it's not that Adam specifically is being laid off, it's this code that I'm in is the one that's being eliminated. And the way that was determined was, one, what codes does the county think they can afford to cut, and then in which departments. And that's how it locates in on the specific code that's going to be cut. Okay. So that's our kind of layoff notice and order. The second thing we'd like to hit is if you're someone who's received, that layoff notice, please be aware, Zeb, this is 30 days notice that you're going to be laid off. what does that trigger for you as far as rights? And we'll be hitting again, like we discussed, your rights to in place and displace accordingly.
That's right. And if I may add a little bit more, and Adam just made reference to 30 days, it's approximately, it's 20 working days, but that typically works out to be about 30 calendar days, right? The contracts makes that distinction. And all different units have different language with regards to that. And did you want to cover like so we went through return to former class, displacement or bumping, and then claiming vacant codes. Did you want to talk about which of those happen at the departmental level versus countywide? Or do you want me to field that? Okay.
If you want to jump in on, I can fill in too.
Okay.
Yeah.
So as he mentioned, as Adam mentioned, first, if you in the theoretical that you do get an actual layoff notice, right? The first thing that happens is you look around. You have the option to be reassigned in lieu of layoff, is what it's called. And so you first look around for other vacant codes of your same level in the county or those that you qualify for. Vacant code is the key, right? And that happens throughout the entire county. You can look anywhere in the employer and see if there's a vacant code. So let's pretend you're a management analyst at social services. There's no vacancies there. You look around the whole county, but there's one over at environmental health. Great, you can claim that one in seniority order. Where there can be some confusion is return to former classification and displacement. So and that's the next order. Let's say there's no vacancies. Then you can return to your former classification. I'm a management analyst now. I used to be a janitor, okay? Now I look around, are there any vacant janitor positions? There aren't, okay. Well, now I can only look for my former classification in that department. I can no longer look countywide. If I'm going back to a former class, I can only look in my current department. So my example, I'm in SSA. I'm looking for janitor positions in SSA. I can't go to another area and claim that. I can if there's none left in my agency. So this is an either or for former classification. The key here is in bumping or displacement, and this is where there's often a lot of confusion. You can only bump or displace in your department or agency. You can't reach into another department. So in my example, SSA, which is a huge, huge agency. For anyone watching this who's in SSA, that includes DOS, the administration, DFCS, DEBS. I'm sure I'm leaving something out, right? I think there's 5 units. I'm sorry, whichever unit I'm forgetting. So you can go to any of those within that agency, right? HHS is another huge one. You go to anything that's part of HHS, right? So, but in my example, you're a management analyst and you have to displace someone, meaning you have to kick someone else out of their code. You can only look within SSA. You can't reach over to facilities and fleet in that janitor code and boot one of those janitors out or whatever it was. So displacement, bumping colloquially, you can only do in your department or agency. And oftentimes there's confusion about that they think, oh, someone's going to reach into my code from outside and bump me. That's not what happens. It's that they claim a vacant position. It's not that they're kicking someone out. So hopefully that clears that. I don't know if we need to cover more on that, but I wanted to make just clear on that point.
Yep.
Okay. Is there anything else you had to say about the layoff order or notice? Or
no, I think we covered the points.
Okay. Do we want to do the Q&As that we got first, or Rebecca, do you want to hit what comes next?
We hit those Q&As first.
Okay. So how's this? I'll read the Q&A. And you guys...
to go next. I have a column.
Okay, sure.
Okay. So as members, as county workers, there's some things that you can do now that we'd like to encourage everyone to do in terms of sharing information with us as SEMA and for looking out for yourself and your department. Primarily identifying areas where there's cost savings. This will help to preserve positions, and you all as department heads and experts in your division can share that information with us, and as well as looking for and identifying for us positions that generate funding, right? Positions that it just wouldn't make sense to cut. It would make dollars and cents instead to preserve. So we'll need that information from you, and we'll be counting on you to help us identify those. In addition, as always, look out for notifications in the SEMA voice on what you can do if we are mobilizing any, actions or ways that you can participate in other ways. Please keep an eye out on that. And as always, send us your questions. Talk to your coworkers about information you get that they might not, and stay involved.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. So we did receive several questions, I think, from site meetings, various, just emails sent to us and so forth. I'm sure we've answered a lot of them, but we did have some specific questions. So why don't I read a couple, and then I guess you can answer, we'll switch off or whatever.
Sure.
So the first is, what is the timeline for layoffs?
Yeah, so I think with the timeline, we unfortunately don't have a super clear timeline right now. Based off the most recent conversations we've had with the county executive, I think that the earliest we would anticipate them reaching out to SEMA for some of those kind of pre-layoff bargaining conversations might be mid-August, maybe, more likely September. I think our sense is that unless things take a dramatic turn for the worse, I would say it's unlikely that we'd be looking at actual layoffs going into effect in this calendar year. I think we'd likely be well through having those conversations about what is this final structure going to look like this year. But something I've said at site meetings recently is that, based on, previous times I've worked in counties and managed layoffs, there's always a strong disincentive to do layoffs that are going to end up going into effect kind of close to that holiday season, Thanksgiving forward to Christmas. And just with the timeline that we're looking at right now, if we started those conversations, say in September, and then the 30 calendar 20 working day notice that Zeb highlighted, it would start putting us pretty close to Thanksgiving. And it's such a bad PR for counties, and the health metrics are so bad when layoffs go into effect around that time period, that I've always seen a strong disinclination to do that. So I think if we were to spitball a timeline, I think we'll likely be in conversations with the county probably in September around what this structure is going to look like. I think if we actually start to effectuate individual layoff notices going out to folks, I would anticipate the beginning of the year. But again, this is a little bit of reading tea leaves right now, and every month looks substantially different from the previous month these days. So that's making a best effort here. That being said, if we were to have other kind of opt-in options, such as taking long-term leaves or golden handshakes, retirement incentives, based on how those conversations with the county go, those kind of things we could anticipate being available possibly sooner. The county will have a strong incentive to get their savings in as soon as possible. Okay, for our second question, what is SEMA doing about potential layoffs right now?
Sure. So I think we've alluded to a lot of this as to what we're doing. The first is a survey went out yesterday. We definitely are taking soundings from the membership as to what your priorities are. In fact, we'll temporarily include a link down below to that survey. Why I say temporarily is it's slated to be open for the next 2 weeks. Is that correct? So it'll be open for the next 2 weeks. After that, we'll pull the link down because obviously you don't want people going to a dead survey, right? But it should give plenty of time for you all to weigh in. As we mentioned, we are already having those preliminary conversations with the county about where might we head. We don't want to get ahead of our membership, right? We need your feedback through the survey and site meetings as to what we'll prioritize. And then, the county's actually in a little bit of an advantageous position here because we've so recently done that research because of the court, and they're heading into these concessionary times, recessionary times, that we're very familiar right now with what are the regulations for PERB, what can we do in terms of a cash payment that doesn't violate the gift of public funds, and what options are available to us that weren't in 2004, 2005, for those of you that remember the golden handshake back then. Now that we have the 2013 PERB legislation, how has that limited what we can do and can't do? So anyway, we're in I think we're in a very strong shape from a research perspective and kind of understanding the options and flexibility and suppleness. And then we'll be relying on input from you all. So I think we're certainly doing things right now and setting up the chessboard. I don't want anyone to think that we're just sitting around waiting for the county to come to us and say, bad news, here's a bunch of people getting laid off. So we're also working the political angle as well.
Yep.
Okay, another question we received is, what happens if I, as a SEMA member, receive a layoff notice?
Yeah, so this is something where, we absolutely recommend, reach out to your rep immediately. Based on the conversations that we're having, we'll likely know where those positions are going to be ahead of time, and we'll have likely already reached out to folks and say, hey, based on the conversations that we're having with the county, and extrapolating those onto the current seniority list, as of right now, you're likely someone who's going to be receiving some of these notices. So preferably you've already got some sense of what's coming, based on myself, Zeb, or Rebecca reaching out and letting you know that, unless something else changes, you'll be getting a notice through this process. But as far as the what mechanically happens, so this is something where, absolutely this is, part of the assistance and help that you're entitled to, as part of being a SEMA member. We will help work through this process with you, and identify what are your options right now. We'll have a list of vacancies available both within your department and elsewhere in the county, so that we can sit down and go through with you, okay, based off of, your individual, this is the position which you currently work in. These are the lower level positions, which you could also go into at a worst case scenario. Here's the positions that you hold underlying status in. This is the range we can look at, and we'll help you look through that and identify what the best option is going to be for you, in that case. Absolutely. Next question we have right here is, can and should I transfer or promote to another position right now?
It's a good question, and it's one that's very difficult to answer. Here's some clear advice that I would like to give, and then it becomes very muddy. As Adam referred to earlier, you want to have underlying status. So that means that you've passed your probationary period in some classification somewhere in the county. Because if you don't, as he mentioned, you're one of the first people to go out the door if you're on probationary status. And if you don't have a position you can claim, then you really do go out the door, right? You're losing your job when I say go out the door. You are not working for the county anymore. If you have underlying status, it doesn't guarantee anything, but it makes you much safer, right? So if you are in your first probationary period in the county, you just started working here, let's say 6 months ago, almost all positions have a 9-month probationary period for the first time you're employed, and you get a new position that you applied for or someone offers it to you, however it works. Maybe it's even provisional or probationary. My advice would be don't take it, because you have no permanent status. So let's say you apply and get that position after you've been here 6 months, you're now in another 9-month probationary period.
Mm-hmm.
And if they decide to eliminate that position, you have nothing to claim. If, however, you have a permanent position, let's go back to my earlier example, you're a management analyst. You've been a management analyst for 10 years, you clearly have permanency in that position, okay, because you passed your probationary period. And then some senior management analyst comes along. Should you take it? Possibly. You have to make that decision for yourself, right? You'd be in a probationary position for the next 6 months, which means if your department chooses to eliminate a senior management analyst, that new position you just promoted to, you're the first one to go. One of the first ones, if there aren't other probationary periods, possibly the first one. It's a risk. The benefit is that you can claim your old position, especially if you haven't changed departments. If you have changed departments and you're trying to claim, maybe there's not one in your new department. So it's all a calculation that you have to make for yourself. In these concessionary times, here's the takeaway that I would recommend to everybody listening to this. The takeaway is right now, it's riskier in a concessionary or reduction time than it is in an expansionary time to take a new position, a probationary position. So just bear that in mind. It might still make sense for you. You might get through the next 6 months of whatever position it is, and smooth sailing, you're really happy you took that promotion. Just make an informed decision is the best thing I can advise.
Absolutely. Some of the other frequent questions that we're getting are some things that we hit in the beginning of this, kind of those definitions around seniority, underlying status. So the one last thing I would leave off is that Zeb, myself, and Rebecca also did a deep dive on the contract, including the layoff section, reading through line by line as part of those contract town halls that we put out after the contract was signed. And they're all posted on SEMA's YouTube page. So if you look down below and you click on the SEMA page and go to videos, you'll see that we have those town halls up there, and they're broken up with timestamps. So if you'd like a close kind of line by line reading of the layoff section, you can also go check that section out. And that might have some of the information that you're looking for. If there was something that you had a question on a particular part of the layoff language that we just haven't been getting frequent questions about and aren't answering here, there's an additional deep dive there that'll be a good resource for you.
Okay, well, I think we covered the most frequently asked questions, right? Did I leave anything out? No.
I think we hit everything.
Yep, I think we did hit everything. I'm sure there are questions that remain unanswered, but this has been a pretty thorough retelling of the layoff procedures, definition of terms, then a brief overview of what the county budget looks like, and then sort of where we're headed with pre-layoff bargaining, really to address some of the budgetary concerns. So are there any final thoughts you want to leave SEMA members with?
Yeah, just the last thing I would say is I know we've definitely had folks reaching out to us if there's contracts in your areas that you're concerned about, or expansions or large capital expenses coming up. Those are definitely things that we're interested to hear, things that we're going to be raising kind of once we get to that pre-bargaining level with the county. Like Rebecca said, those are definitely things that we're happy to have you reach out to us about, so that we can do some research now on them. Additionally, once layoffs come out, we're definitely going to need leaders in each department to help us go through and identify what's the strongest case we can make for not cutting positions. We absolutely don't want to, for example, be cutting positions that have substantial matching funds from the state or the feds, positions with braided funding, those kind of things. So we're going to need definitely help and support from members in each affected area to help make the strongest case we can in defense of SEMA positions in each area. So we'll definitely have more information coming out as we approach that timeline. And we'll be looking to you guys as experts in your areas as well to help us through this process.
That's right. And this video has been mostly dedicated, as I'm sure you can tell, to the mechanics of the layoff procedure, not on our budgetary strategy, right? Which is a very separate thing, and we're also engaged in. But as everybody has pointed out, we are relying on you to be our eyes and ears. So even though we may not have a layoff today, if one of the positions that's slated for elimination as part of the budget cut is that revenue generating position, you're literally a revenue collector at DTAC, or maybe you're, and the last time I ran the numbers on this, the average person there is collecting more than $1 million a year for the county. It doesn't make sense to get rid of one of those positions, right? It just doesn't. So that's the kind of nuance that we need your help on if something that just doesn't make sense for elimination right now is happening. But
absolutely.
Okay, well, we look forward. Well, of course, we'll always continue to field any questions as they come in. I would encourage you to share this video with your colleagues, because I feel it will answer a lot of the questions that are out there right now. Okay,
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for viewing. Take care.